Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Right to Know, your weekly Pennsylvania policy podcast. Excuse me, from the PLS Reporter. As always, I'm here with my co-host Sam Zern, and we have two pretty significant topics to talk about this week. We know it's a holiday weekend, so we're going to give you a bit of an abbreviated version of these two things. One has to do with vaccines and the other school funding. So to start things off, there was some pretty big, significant news that came out of Harrisburg this week regarding the state's COVID-19 vaccine rollout. And as we've talked about in the past, the state's rollout was a bit slow and frustrating at the beginning of this year. It was, kind of a convoluted process in terms of who can get the vaccine, where they can get the vaccine, how they go about getting that vaccine. So, we've talked about it at length. It was, a bit of an ordeal if you were someone who was eligible, in January, February, and you wanted to get this. But the good news is the state's come a long way since that point. And Acting Health Secretary Allison Beam this week said that beginning on April 19th, all Pennsylvanians will be eligible for a COVID-19 vaccine. So that means regardless of what phase you're in, whether you have underlying conditions or not, if you live in Pennsylvania and you're an adult, you will be eligible come April 19th. And that announcement comes as the result of an accelerated plan that Beam and the administration has rolled out and provided detail on this week. So just to give you a sense of what that means, starting on March 31st, which was a couple of days ago, that was like the first step of this accelerated plan. So on the 31st, law enforcement officers, firefighters, grocery store workers, food and agriculture workers, they all became eligible to schedule vaccine appointments starting then. So those are various types of essential workers. They weren't included in phase 1A. But that was, really the next step in getting more people vaccinated. And I believe Wolf had initially kind of slated those various, what's the word I'm looking for here, Sam? Professions, thank you. He had slated those professions for, sort of another special initiative similar to, educators and school staff. But so they're, they were the next step and the first step in terms of this accelerated plan. Next comes phase 1B, which includes people in various congregate settings, public transit workers, postal workers, clergy, all anyone who's in phase 1B, they will be eligible to schedule appointments starting on April 5th. Then on April 12th, phase 1C will open up. That's essential workers in construction, legal field, legal services, government employees, energy sectors, media, and other, saw Sam with a smirk there, other professions in phase 1C. And then after that, the next date to really keep an eye on is April 19th. And that's when anybody who isn't included in 1B or 1C, they will become eligible for the COVID-19 vaccine. So, this is something that popped up as other states started making all adults eligible. I believe Ohio was one. New York set a date for, when their adult population could get vaccinated. All of Pennsylvania's neighbors were starting to, expand vaccine eligibility. And then as that happened, and of course, supply improved. That's when the Wolf administration pulled the trigger and, laid out more of a concrete timetable for when people can get vaccinated. I just, for those listening to kind of drill that into your head again, that's, March 31st, law enforcement, firefighters, grocery store workers, other essential employees, April 5th, phase 1B, April 12th, phase 1C, and April 19th, any adult in Pennsylvania. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that said too, it's not necessarily that, April 19th hits, you're going to get it. It does open up for scheduling.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll have to see how far out different providers are going to be scheduling. I think the Secretary of Health also mentioned that there's a little bit more, I want to say a little bit more planning room that providers have now. They have a little bit more consistency in the numbers as far as how many vaccines they're getting, so they'll know how to schedule out a little further. But we're opening up to, gosh, it's about 2 million people between phases 1B and 1C in the next 2 weeks, and then everybody else. So that's going to be a massive increase in the amount of people. Phase 1A is about 3.5 to 4 million people that we're now getting to the end of. Obviously, they can still get a vaccine once the new dates kick in. You can always go, if you're in the past ones, you're always eligible. But yeah, so we're going to have just a very sudden influx of a lot of people very quickly. So we'll see how scheduling goes. I am positive that is going to be the conversation in the upcoming pressers is scheduling.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we've, like I said, we've come a long way since January and February when people were, struggling to just schedule and find a vaccine. But I imagine, there will be a bit of a log jam, you would think, as, more and more people try and, schedule and register for an appointment right now. And you did make a good point there that I also wanted to highlight once again, which was that, if you're in a past phase and another phase opens up, that, does not prohibit you from getting a vaccine if you want one. That's something that, being pointed out this week. If you're in phase 1A and 1B opens up, you can still get your vaccine. Same if, you're in phase 1B and 1C opens up, it doesn't matter. That's just kind of when they're allowing more people to, take advantage of this. So nothing is stopping anyone in previous phases from, scheduling a vaccine appointment. I think that, hits on the major points of the vaccine announcement. Wolf also announced on Friday, today when we're recording this, that the special initiative to vaccinate educators did wrap up with over 100,000 educators and school staff getting vaccinations thanks to that special initiative. So I think the bottom line with vaccines is we're seeing progress. I can't underscore enough how frustrated people were at times, with how the state rollout has been. But I think both Pennsylvania and nationally, we are just starting to see, some improvement as supply increases. Governments and providers build out infrastructure. So we're seeing progress, and I think we can only hope that it continues. But Sam, I talked a lot there, and you're giggling in excitement in the other Zoom here, but you have some information on a school funding lawsuit. That's something that you've been monitoring for a long time. So I'm not even gonna, obviously I edited your story, but I'm not gonna try and get into the minutia here. So there's a lawsuit regarding school funding in Pennsylvania. Tell us what it is, what it's seeking to accomplish, and who initiated this.
Okay, so this lawsuit is a pretty big deal. So this is pretty landmark, historic. That's the title, the headlines people are using right now. So in 2014, a group of parents, school districts, and 2 education advocacy associations, the NAACP and the Association of Rural and Small Schools, that's what it is, yes, came together and sued the state over the school funding system. And their essential argument comes down to the Constitution of Pennsylvania says that the General Assembly shall provide for the maintenance and support of a thorough and efficient system of public education to serve the needs of the Commonwealth. And they are saying that our current education funding system does not do that. And in fact, it drastically underfunds schools in a way that violates even further the Equal Protection Clause. In a quote from the original 2014 complaint is, they say, it turns the caliber of public education into an accident of geography. So pretty incisive there, honestly. Really just really just taking the entire way we fund schools to task, really. So that was filed in 2014. It's been 7 years, which is a pretty long amount of time. I talked to some people who are members of the council team back in February and asked, is this normal? And they said, well, every lawsuit is different, but this has gone on for quite some time now. But by and large, even though we've had 7 years, by and large, a lot of the arguments that the plaintiffs make in this case remain the same about school funding in the Commonwealth in Pennsylvania. Largely, they are centering on, gosh, there's just so much to explain here. I'm trying to think of the best way to start this. So essentially, I guess the way to start would be how Pennsylvania does fund its schools. So the state contributes about 38% of the budget allocates that to school districts, and local tax bases provide the rest to their school districts. As I'm sure a lot of listeners know, when you did your taxes or are doing them or should get them done, you pay taxes to your school district. And so that funding, the way that it plays out in Pennsylvania, the plaintiffs are arguing, puts a significantly heavier burden on poorer districts because the state is not contributing enough money to, bring everybody up to par. So wealthier districts, their tax bases are wealthier. They can get more of that local funding, whereas poorer districts can't really meet that same level. And so the estimate that one analysis has is that there's a shortfall of about $4.6 billion in school funding in the Commonwealth. And there's largely a rich-poor divide, which I imagine you would expect in this kind of thing. And so that's really what the lawsuit centers on, is that the way the state funds schools hurts kids in certain areas more than it does in others. And it's really the state's job to make up that funding. And so the lawsuit, essentially what they want is to deem the current system unconstitutional and to compel the General Assembly, whose job it is to set these funding requirements. Like, the court's not going to be the one to decide the funding formula for the future, but to compel the General Assembly to create a funding formula that is equitable, is adequate. It's not just an equity problem. They're also arguing that straight up there's not enough money for schools in general. The pie is both too small and unevenly cut. And so that's kind of like the basic overview. I realize as I'm talking that I'm saying a lot of pronouns without antecedents because there's a lot in there. I will say that, yeah.
No, I do just want to jump in and clarify here. So if, let's say this lawsuit would be successful, would the General Assembly then have to come up with a completely new way of funding schools?
Not necessarily. So it's
okay. So let me cut in again. If this is successful, what happens?
Well, the General Assembly will have to come up with a way to fund schools that is equitable and adequate. The thing that we currently have is we do have a formula in the Commonwealth that is generally agreed, does a pretty good job. So you've probably heard this, the fair funding formula. So back in 2014, ahead of this case actually being filed, the legislature convened a basic education funding commission, which was kind of tasked with, look at how we fund schools and figure out how to do it better. The Commonwealth had been through some pretty rough years ahead of that, or before that, following the 2008 recession, an influx of one-time federal dollars and stimulus money, and then that money not being replaced in school budgets in the mid to late 2000s, that really left schools in a lurch. So the funding commission was kind of looking at how do we address school funding just in the state. And what they came up with is a formula that includes weights for things like student poverty, English language learners or students with limited English proficiency, both of those groups of students tend to need a little bit of extra resources. You know, you need extra teachers who may be bilingual or have the training to, you know, help with English language learning. You may need extra counseling staff, trauma-informed training, that kind of stuff. And also things like sparsity. So we have a lot of rural school districts that take extra things like more transportation or internet connectivity, just things that about a school district that, you know, they don't really have control over, but that do make educating kids adequately more expensive. And so the Basic Education Funding Commission comes up with a formula that adds some weights to those numbers, or to those like qualities or demographic information. And so when money is allocated to schools, schools with a little bit more of those expensive needs get that extra boost up, you know, that a school district that doesn't have a lot of those challenges wouldn't need. So we have that funding formula. And actually in that got put into place in 2016, but not fully. So that's something that the plaintiffs have brought up a lot, and I mentioned in the article I wrote, which does this in a far less scattered way than I'm talking about it. But they put that into place in 2016 with a provision called hold harmless, which essentially says that no district can go, no district allocation, no amount of money can drop below the 2013 and 14 funding levels for schools. So everybody's basic education allocation has to stay at least at what it was in 2014. So only new money in the education budget can go through the fair funding formula. And the plaintiffs, their calculation is only about 11% of funding goes through that fair funding formula. And a teacher I spoke with, he brought up the point. He said, well, schools were inequitably funded in 2013 and 2014. So now that's just like solidified. That's just in the law now, that level of funding. And some he's not, the teacher I spoke with isn't involved in the lawsuit. Some of the plaintiffs have said like, they're not really concerned with hold harmless itself. It's more the entire system. Because hold harmless is it's a challenge. I mean, it's hard because nobody wants to see their school district lose money. If all of the funding that goes to schools goes through the fair funding formula, some districts would lose money. And that's the point that plaintiffs make of how there's just not enough. Because if anybody's losing funding, then clearly there's not enough funding. That's kind of the point they're making there. So, I mean, the fair funding formula could potentially be used to like meet this equity goal, but it does sound to me like it doesn't make up for the adequacy component. So that's one of the ones that like the General Assembly is going to have to take up. And a lot of lawmakers have talked about fair funding for years now, 7 years now, in listening to their constituents who are involved here and listening to their school districts. So there are ideas out there. Whether or not they get picked up is definitely going to be a challenge. And actually, I mean, we did see efforts towards this fair funding in particular back in January when Governor Wolf introduced his budget proposal, which would put all of the education funding through the fair funding formula and shore up the amount of money so that nobody drops below that hold harmless level. So there is that idea. I'm not positive that that would actually meet any of the like that idea specifically would meet what the plaintiffs are asking for, because it still has that like hold harmless, and it's still it's still not necessarily putting like enough new money in every year. I think they're looking a little bit more for a restructuring in general. So yeah. Did I answer your question at all?
Yeah. So let me ask a timeline question. Did we talk about the date at all?
I'll say it again, September 9th. Just in case. September 9th is when it'll be heard, and that's in Commonwealth Court.
So did advocates say at all how long they think that this trial might last?
Well, so I asked. I figured I always feel bad asking that question to lawyers because they're like, I can't really tell you that, and I can't tell you, after it goes to trial, how long it'll be till we hear something, and if we hear something good, how long it'll be till we put something in. So that was kind of their answer is, we don't quite know. Hopefully we'd hear somewhat quickly after trial a decision. Now, the timeline for the General Assembly taking that up is going to be determined, I believe, by the judge. So that will be, or by the courts. So
and that's if it's successful.
Exactly. If it's successful, there's a giant caveat hanging over that. So that would be, its own timeline. But one of the attorneys on the case did say, the General Assembly could do this anytime they wanted. Like, they could just take up the issue of inequitable school funding and create a new formula anytime. So, I mean, could happen, but it might take till they're compelled by the court, if they're compelled by the court, to actually see some movement.
So you said there's been some legislation introduced to address, the issue of school funding and inequitable school funding. But has there been any legislative reactions to this lawsuit in particular?
Not that I've heard recently. I mean, so it is against the legislature. The lawsuit is brought against Governor Tom Wolf, Acting Education Secretary Noe Ortega, I believe. I believe he's on there. He would be by now. We had to switch over. And the General Assembly, leadership in the General Assembly. But it's just naming the leaders, because that's generally how,
Right.
Saw a lot of that in the elections lawsuit. But yeah, the main people mounting the defense are not the governor and not the Department of Education. It's, one of the attorneys on the case said that the main folks on the defense are Brian Cutler and Jake Corman, over in the General Assembly side. And now they haven't really spoken on it publicly, as far as I know. In the past, when it was against Joseph Scarnati, he did file a motion to try and dismiss the case, saying that the fair funding formula made it moot. That got dismissed. And then earlier this year, the news came out that, earlier this year, the court dismissed an argument from Jake Corman, I believe, that wanted to remove two of the plaintiffs whose children have since graduated from Pennsylvania schools from the case, and not have them involved in the trial. And the court dismissed that as well. So there's been some movement, but I mean, honestly, people are very reticent to talk about ongoing litigation. Yeah. I mean, like the teacher I spoke with, he was also at the press conference. He's kind of there's a group called Teach Plus PA. They do a lot of teacher advocacy. And they kind of like have folks to talk about these types of cases who are not involved directly, but who can speak to some of the challenges. So that's kind of the hard part of some of these cases, is that they are very careful in who talks when, because that all has to now play into the courtroom. So it's not super public. I mean, in the legislature, we've had from, I think, Reps Chris Rabb and Lisa Boscola, I think that's who it is. Oh gosh, I hope I didn't misquote them, who have both talked about fair funding before or introduced legislation to do it in certain ways. But it hasn't really moved. I will say Senator Pat Brown, he has been pretty vocal about school funding. He was involved back in 2014 on the fair funding, or on the Education Funding Commission. And, I heard that from the teacher I spoke with, who's teaches in Allentown, that's Brown's district over there, said he's been a pretty strong voice for school funding, not necessarily moving anything, but he does draw attention to it. And he did bring up fair funding in the Senate budget hearing 3 weeks ago now, but more just to ask about funding formulas, federal aid, governor's budget, kind of just general question to PDE, can you give us the lay of the land? So, I mean, I think we'll hear more as we get closer to September, and as, advocacy picks up, honestly, around the case.
I think that was a pretty good rundown, especially, for those who might not have any clue, what this suit entails, because honestly, before you brought it up, it was pretty foreign to me. Um,
It's been a hard one because it's been so out of because it's moved so
and
slowly.
right,
Yeah, there's like a lot of the coverage you see at each step of the way over the last 7 years kind of does its own, like, here's the rundown of the whole history before we get into the news. So to listeners, you can do that over at our site. I tried to run down the whole thing because it was one of my first times really diving into it. And it's incredibly interesting, and there's a lot of data and details out there. Like, I don't want to necessarily like I'm not trying to like promote any sort of side in this case or anything, but the Public Interest Law Center and the Education Law Center who are involved have a website, Fund Our Schools PA, that like dives into all of their feelings on the case and their data, their stances, and that kind of stuff. And it is extensive. So it's one of those that I think is worth reading no matter what, because if you are somebody who has a school district nearby, everyone, or a parent or anything like that, it's worth looking into some of the numbers and just seeing what your education funding looks like. And then PDE has all their own data. And like, now I'm just saying, please, everybody join me in my education policy obsession. Yeah, that's my promo of the day. Just like, hey, everyone learn to like the numbers with me.
I think the bottom line is, people have to head over to theplistreporter.com and, read your free story, looking at the impending trial here in September.
Definitely do that.
Do you think there's anything you glossed over, or does that kind of hit on some of the main points, most of the main points?
That hits on most of the main points. I will say I did not include this in my story at all, but it is also from my coverage this week. There's a huge amount of federal stimulus aid coming to Pennsylvania schools. I don't think that that's going to do much in this lawsuit because, this is about long-term funding formulas and that kind of thing. But the amount of money that's coming into schools is really setting some of the conversation in this budget season about school funding. And so I have, as usual, I have a fun little map on our website that's free that just shows the amount of money coming to all the school districts. And so another shameless plug for a good map. That's available for free at our site.
Does that mean we should get into our usual shameless plugs?
I think it is time to continue the shameless plugs.
Well, I think we've talked a lot about the plistreporter.com. So if you happen to not be a PList Reporter subscriber, please head over again to the plistreporter.com. We have a big subscribe button at the top of our menu. And you can get access to all of our coverage for just $16.67 a month. And if you're listening to this podcast, you probably have an idea of where you can get it. But if you don't, you can find us at righttoknow.podbean.com, or really wherever you like to get your podcasts. Spotify, Apple, Google, iHeart, we're all there. And Sam and I and the PList Reporter as an outlet are all on Twitter. You can find us at the PList Reporter or myself at Justin_Schweitzer.
I'm at Sam_Zern.
And I think that about does it for this week. Last week I said to enjoy the weather outside, but depending on where you are in Pennsylvania, this week it's kind of cold. So I don't know, maybe that's good for some people. If you enjoy the cold, get one last little blast of cold air. But otherwise, enjoy the weekend, and we will be back next week. Thanks for listening.